This is Committable. I'm Jesse Mangan, and for this episode, we are talking about a report on involuntary commitments in North Carolina that was recently released by Disability Rights North Carolina. And I'm very lucky to have with me here Corye Dunn. Corye, do you want to introduce yourself? Say whatever you want about who you are and the type of work you do.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm Corye Dunn. I'm the Director of Public Policy at Disability Rights North Carolina, and I've been with the agency for 14 years. And I have a personal connection, both individually, personally, and family connection to inpatient treatment and its collateral consequences. And also just work with an incredible community of advocates and people with lived experience who really want to see things make more sense. And so I feel really lucky to get to talk to folks about this report and about what we understand about the system so that folks can talk about what is possible and what could be better.
Thank you. I think right before we talk about the report specifically, it'd be good to get a general overview of how the involuntary hospitalization to commitment process works in North Carolina.
Sure. So the law is pretty straightforward. I say that relatively speaking, right? So here are the steps. There's a petitioner. That means a person who goes to the court uh, and says, I think this person, named the respondent, needs to be held involuntarily for the safety of themselves or others. The standard is mental illness or developmental disability and behaviors that pose a risk of harm to self or others. So there's a dangerousness element and there is a condition or diagnosis element to it. And a magistrate then signs what is called a custody order. Now, these petitioners can be anyone. Often they are healthcare providers, but sometimes they are family members who are deeply concerned and people who genuinely want what is best for the respondent, but don't know any other way to access services. That is what we hear over and over again, is that involuntary commitment for the petitioners, when we're talking about people with personal relationships with a respondent, it's an act of desperation. And I think that points to the big problem. But getting back to the procedure, often we're talking about healthcare professionals. It could be that someone just presented voluntarily, even in an emergency department seeking treatment. And as you'll see in our report, the sort of default setting in many places is to choose IVC, involuntary commitment, rather than pursuing voluntary admission for a variety of convenience and systemic ease factors. So you get a custody order from a magistrate. The person might be in their home or might be already in an emergency department at this point. And there's a first evaluation that typically happens at an emergency department or a place like a behavioral health urgent care or a facility-based crisis center. And then if that evaluation says that this person meets the criteria for involuntary commitment, then the respondent, can be transferred to what's called a 24-hour facility or a IVC receiving facility. Those terms are used interchangeably in North Carolina. And these are facilities that have been designated as eligible to receive people under involuntary commitment by the Department of Health and Human Services. And within 24 hours of arrival at that facility, there's a second evaluation. Now, importantly, the first evaluation can be conducted by telemedicine. And the second evaluation is conducted in person. So those are, if folks are wondering why there are two evaluations, that's part of it. If the second evaluation produces a recommendation for involuntary commitment, then within 10 days of the original custody, so the first time that a police officer or an emergency room physician or someone has exercised custody over the respondent, then they're entitled to a judge and to appointed counsel. That's the first time you get an attorney. So that's just the nuts and bolts of it. And technically, you're not under an involuntary commitment order until you get to that hearing and a judge rules that you can be held against your will. But it certainly felt like you were being held against your will during all of that time. So I think a lot of people say, well, I was committed. And what in terms of the statutes, what actually happened was they were brought in on a custody order. And maybe they were evaluated at the ED, maybe they were evaluated at the facility. Certainly none of that was voluntary. And so you see a lot of imprecision in people talking past each other. And we want to get away from that and really talk about what does it take to not coerce and force people into treatment? What does it take for people to get their needs met in a way that feels safe and dignified and is completely voluntary?
So that's the process in how it should be expected to work, I suppose. And I appreciate you identifying the language component because when you're a person going through it, if you don't have previous experience with the system, it's all the same thing. For you, it is one period of being shifted from one place to another, and it's not
And
voluntary.
potentially in North Carolina, be handcuffed, shackled, transported in a marked police car by a uniformed officer. That feels carceral. That is carceral. And so the experience from the issuance of the custody order is of concern to us. I think sometimes the folks who live in this space want to focus on the judicial hearing that you're entitled to within 10 days. That is not the beginning of the serious consequences for the people we serve.
I think there is a hope that the judicial process is going to be meaningful or robust. But I think as you're talking, one of the points where it seems like there might be a problem or confusion is the magistrate. Because if there is an applicant, someone fills out an application saying, I believe this person, whoever they are, this person needs to be evaluated. And the assumption would be that the applicant is filling it out in good faith and they have reasonable concerns. But then the magistrate gets the application, and it sounds like from that point, a magistrate is looking at a very, I would assume, low standard of cause, like probable cause. Is that what they're doing?
Well, what they're saying is that it seems more likely than not that the allegations as presented, the allegations being that a person has a condition and is experiencing symptoms such that they present a risk of harm to themselves or to someone else, that allegation is true. Now, there's little to no evidence, and this is where a lot of our recommendations in the report live. It could be observations. So if my mom has noticed indications of self-harm on my body for example, and is concerned that it is escalating and that I am at risk for serious harm, right? So maybe I've been cutting, maybe, engaging in some self harm that is not seriously dangerous, but it's escalating. That might be cause for concern, and my mother might write a petition for involuntary commitment on me, at which point I would be taken into custody. All she would have to say is she's engaging in self harm. She has a history of this diagnosis, this behavior, and I believe that she is a risk to herself. That's it. That's pretty flimsy stuff. But it's also perceived as a real safety valve or safety net for the petitioners, right? Family members have had such difficulty accessing supports for their loved ones and really engaging with mental health, not mental health services, but engaging with mental health, that they will try anything. And some well intentioned person probably said, you can just go get them committed. And then they do. And not only do we see that there's real harm for the person who is committed, these relationships are damaged, maybe forever. And that is not therapeutic, not recovery focused, not the kind of lives we all want for ourselves.
That seemed to be a trend or a theme running throughout the report is that people, for people, this is the only system they have. This is the only system they have access to. And so the easiest thing, rather than systemic change that provides more robust community services, the easiest thing is to initiate a petition or an application that gets someone brought into the system, and you hope someone identifies the problem. And if the first point of contact is the magistrate, what sort of training or qualification does the magistrate have to really filter out who needs to be brought into this process?
Not nearly enough. So, our recommendations really do focus on what do magistrates need to know or understand, and what could magistrates ask or do in this process that might prevent unnecessary commitments. So we recommend, for example, that magistrates must ask and document that they've discussed with the petitioner other alternatives. Have they sought care in, for example, a peer-led recovery-based service provider? Do they have connection with a long-term relationship with a mental health provider? Have they called a pure warm line or 988? Or have there been even modest efforts at trying something less coercive than being hauled into an emergency department in a police car and then transported across the state, potentially in shackles?
So, strong, meaningful recommendations make sense. Then once the magistrate receives that application, they review it, and they're basically just, I mean, it sounds like the magistrate might not have a lot of choice. They're just reviewing to see, does all of this seem reasonable?
Yeah, if these facts, as alleged, are true,
Right.
would this be a reasonable next step? And we don't really provide magistrates enough information or training to make that decision in a responsible way. And I think people are fearful that they will contribute. They feel a sense of responsibility that if custody and forced treatment is painted as uh, a, a kind and generous thing to do to and for someone, it feels like you are withholding services if you don't sign off on that order. Now, that's not true, but that's what we hear in the community, is that no one wants to be the one who refused to sign an order and 24 hours later, the mother who brought you that petition has a dead child. That is a real concern. Now, that fear doesn't really make sense when you read the stories in our report, though. We're talking about children who were presenting voluntarily with their parents at a healthcare provider, and then they were involuntarily committed and transported across the state to services that the parents would never have agreed to. How is that helping anyone? But even if someone is truly not interested in voluntary treatment, does not want to engage in voluntary treatment first, there might be really good reasons, and we might want to address those. But second, there are other options. We show these models in the report where Durham, North Carolina has a program called HEART that provides non-law enforcement response to people in crisis and non-coercive support that is always centered on peers. And if there is some measure of indication of risk of harm, like, for example, someone is brandishing a weapon, then you could do a co-response model with law enforcement. But it's really important that we not treat mental health symptoms as crimes, because I can't think of a faster way to get people to avoid seeking care when they need and want it.
I think one of the things that always comes up in these sorts of conversations is the idea that the federal law has, or federal precedent has established that for a civil commitment, for that hearing where you actually get a hearing, the standard is clear and convincing evidence. And the reasoning, the justification for that is this is a serious deprivation of liberty. We do not want to initiate this unless it's absolutely necessary. And then there's all this gray area with these beginning processes where people don't want to take the risk that something bad happens. It's totally understandable. I guess where I sort of struggle with the logic of that sometimes is there are a lot of people who might be in some sort of potential danger in some way at some point, but we only do this if we think they're potential danger in some way and they have a diagnosable mental illness. And so there's that concern for me of you have
Prima
acknowledged,
facie discrimination.
yes, yes.
Yeah, we have that concern too.
Good. So a person being brought into this process, the magistrate is someone, what they're kind of there to facilitate the process, assuming that if all of these accusations seem reasonable and if they are true, I just have to get this person to the next step. And then the magistrate signs a custody order. I think a custody order might sound a little tamer than a warrant or something like that. But does that
Feels like
functionally
a
what?
warrant.
Yes.
What
Yeah.
it does is if you're already in, let's say, an emergency department, it allows them to prevent you from leaving.
Okay.
And if you are not, it allows for law enforcement to come pick you up and take you to such a facility where you could be prevented from leaving. So it is exactly what it sounds like. It is custody in the sense that we understand it from the criminal justice system. And so it very much feels as if you are being told you have done something wrong, you are in trouble, you have no choice about what happens next in this process. And that can be terrifying. I mean, people experience extreme distress. And there's, in addition to not providing enough training for magistrates, which we recommend an awful lot more of that, we also don't provide enough training to these law enforcement officers who are tasked with transporting someone in a mental health crisis. Goodness, if I were in their shoes, I would feel deeply uncomfortable with how much information I'm given about what this person needs and what my role is in keeping them and anyone else safe. And in North Carolina, we see that the interaction where a custody order is served and executed, that would be where a sheriff's deputy shows up at your house and says, you got to come with me, we're going to the hospital. It can devolve quickly. Objection, I don't want to go, I didn't do anything wrong, I didn't hurt anybody, can be perceived by a person who's trained in criminal justice practices. That sounds an awful lot like resisting arrest. And so we've trained law enforcement officers to address criminal activity. And then when we apply that training to people who are experiencing emotional distress or mental health crisis, it's really dangerous because you're presuming that there is a voluntariness and a willfulness to this behavior. We've certainly seen horrific stories of law enforcement interactions with people with disabilities of all sorts go wrong in really tragic ways. And we never want to see that happen again.
Yeah, I think it is important to keep going back to language. And when you talk about this process at this stage, they are accusations. There's generally some form of distress present. What to do with that distress or about that
Right.
distress is the question. But there's generally some sort of distress, and so but anything being said by the applicant is an accusation. Um, and there are other situations like you were describing where parents bring their child to emergency department or wherever, and then the involuntary commitment process is initiated maybe
By
without the
a healthcare provider.
what is the logic offered for that? Why are they saying they feel they have to initiate this process on a child who's there with their parents?
That is a really good question. In some cases, it's as frustratingly simple as that's just how we do things here. And it's unquestioned, and that is problematic. But it's also for such frustratingly simple reasons as the parents couldn't provide transportation. So we needed a law enforcement officer to transport them to the only bed that's available at an inpatient facility that's 3.5 hours away. So you can imagine that you're particularly vulnerable to this if you don't have access to safe, reliable transportation, for example, or if the parents are working the kind of job where taking time off for a medical emergency is very difficult or puts them at risk of losing their job, then you can imagine how it would seem like a kindness to provide transportation. For anyone who's just listening on audio, there are air quotes there because just providing transportation would involve a human being driving a vehicle.
Hmm.
Simply, not necessarily a law enforcement officer who restrains the person under custody order or the person in custody, and certainly not with the kind of adversarial or potentially antagonistic type of engagement that you would expect in the criminal justice setting.
Yeah, one of the things that sort of stands out to me is there's a law as written, there's sort of the plain text of it, whatever the intent was when it was written, and then there's practice, clinical practice, whatever it is. So in a situation like that, you're issuing this report and you're issuing recommendations. What do you recommend in regards to that clinical practice?
Stop it.
Fantastic.
I think that there are several things we can do to make it less likely to happen on an
Mhm.
ongoing basis. One of the things we recommend is shifting some of the risk. So if you, as a healthcare provider, have no downside
Mhm.
for filing a petition, then your risk calculation is, well, it's just safer to go ahead and petition them. And we've heard that. It's just safer. And we hear that healthcare providers, physicians in emergency departments are advised by legal counsel at hospitals. It's safer if you just go ahead and petition them. Because if they decide they're frustrated with you and want to walk out and engage in self-harm, which is um, often follows involuntary treatment, uh, then there's a concern that there might be liability. And I find it difficult. I find it difficult to see that that concern is reasonable. I really have tried to put myself in those shoes. And um, but we know that there are real harms that are borne by the respondent. Forced treatment is traumatizing in and of itself. And so, compounding whatever distress is going on with a new trauma, or perhaps a repeated trauma, because for many people this happens more than once, that seems particularly cruel, right? We know that that is a consequence of forced treatment. On the other hand, there are very few predictable collateral consequences for the healthcare providers, for the hospital, for the doctor who petition for IVC. So perhaps there should be some risk of financial cost or liability of some sort if there isn't a reasonable basis to petition for IVC to begin with.
Yeah, it seems obvious from sort of a step back that whenever a state issues or the government in any capacity issues authority, with authority comes protections. And one of the protections should be accountability for whoever has the authority. And this is one of those areas within our system where a lot of protection has been given for people who start or initiate this process, but there's very little sort of accountability for the person who's potentially being harmed, the respondent, the person being detained like that. And it makes so much sense. So accountability, some potential accountability to slow the process down, give people an incentive to reconsider.
Absolutely. We call them speed bumps. We think there should be some speed bumps in the process. It shouldn't, you know, it shouldn't be the easiest choice to restrict someone's liberty to get them health care. We would never suggest that that makes sense in any setting other than mental health. That's just not how we provide healthcare, because we know it's not the most effective way to provide healthcare. And you know, I I think about the ways in which lots of us have behaviors that are less than optimally healthy, right? I happen to have seen people smoking cigarettes. Right? We don't stop people from doing things that are unhealthy. We don't even force people to manage their blood sugar, right? That seems absurd. If we don't put a continuous glucose monitor on someone with diabetes and duct tape it to them and say, like, not your choice, and here's the insulin pump, like, you're gonna have regulated blood sugar. That is not a thing we do. And the the serious and invasive and non-therapeutic nature of those kind of interventions seem obvious to everyone. But because we have this stigma and this discomfort around mental health needs and mental health treatment, it is taken for granted that, of course, sometimes you'll have to force people into that treatment and they'll thank you later. They will not thank you later. That has not been our experience.
Yeah, I think there's something belittling and dehumanizing about being reduced to a childlike state in this process, which is functionally what the government is often doing. They're saying, because we view you as whatever, with whatever diagnosis, you are being reduced to the autonomy of a child, and we are the parent state. There's something dehumanizing about being an adult going through that, but there also just this is happening to children. And
To
one of the,
children.
yes.
And so children can never voluntarily, an 11-year-old cannot just walk into an emergency department, say I'm having a mental health crisis, and consent to voluntary inpatient treatment 3 hours away. So we would always have a parent involved in that kind of decision, or if a parent was unavailable, some other legally responsible adult. But if they present with their parent voluntarily seeking treatment, we can take the authority away from the parent, right? The child never had that authority. The child never had the authority to consent to really serious treatment options. But for some reason, we don't evaluate the fitness of the parent. We say, if your child is sick, we can take that decision-making authority away from you, parent. And we'll do it for your own good, and you'll thank us later. And as you can see in the report, they do not thank folks later. It is incredibly traumatizing. It is a family trauma whose consequences last a very long time.
Uh, in the report, do you talk with family members, you talk with people in communities? I think one of the things that I've talked about before is ripple effects. That when you take someone out of a community, not only are you taking that person out of their life, and there's going to be effects and consequences for that on that person, but you're also affecting a community. What are sort of some of the ripple effects you're hearing about from parents, from community members who are seeing someone they care about pulled into this process?
Well, I want to take that in two parts. I want to talk about kids and adults separately here, because I think there are different concerns in each of those spaces, some overlap. But for adults, you're presuming that this person has no other responsibilities or obligations. So someone is removed from, or someone is placed in custody, they're not going to work. That very likely means they're not getting paid. It may destabilize their housing, right? They might not be able to pay their rent or mortgage. They might lose their job. The work is not getting done in any case, right? So, with very little information, notification, this person is disappeared from their life in a way that doesn't protect them from job loss, housing loss, educational displacement. We've seen young adults who are engaged in higher education who wind up having to repeat an entire semester because they were yanked up in the middle of the semester and committed, and no one ever told their professors, right? Can you imagine? You just look irresponsible. It looks like you flaked out. You didn't flake out. You were forcibly removed from your life. And even if I were able to concede that on a given case that it is reasonable for them to have been removed from their life, we have done nothing to protect the life they are going to return to after commitment. Because commitment is, in theory, a very short-term process on the order of days, weeks, though we see it last months and years, frankly. I think that when we treat people as not connected to their communities, we cause these harms that, you've got a lapsed rent payment. You might have an eviction proceeding. So you've now created another court case. You've created a bunch of trash on the street, because have you ever seen an eviction? You've got jobs not getting done, kids not getting picked up from school. People have lives and responsibilities, and just sucking them up out of their lives and putting them in forced treatment is deeply disrespectful of the life they've built for themselves. So that's a problem with adults. All of those things are also a problem with children, but you're also doing this to the parent. So, one, we see relationships between children and parents really harmed because parents feel an enormous sense of guilt for presenting for voluntary treatment and not knowing that being converted to involuntary treatment was one of the possible consequences. And that can really feel like a betrayal. Or you've got parents who seek involuntary treatment because that's the best information they have. And that really harms the relationship. I suspect, I'm not a clinician or a data person, I'm a lawyer, but I suspect that those relationships could be really important scaffolding for recovery and healing. But that's going to be harder once that trust is broken. If you want your child to come to you when there are bad things happening in their heads, it's going to be harder if they believe that they might be IVC'd again. The other thing about kids, though, is that kids inherently don't live alone, live in a family of some sort, right? There are adults responsible for that child. And if you take them away from that system and then just drop them back in when treatment's over, it's less likely that that system is going to be able to support them in their recovery, even if the treatment were excellent and effective. And that's not a given. But even if the treatment were effective and excellent, it would still be hard to reintegrate into your life, into your family. What are we doing to make sure that the family system heals, that kids have the support they need when they go home? And how are you going to do that if you're in inpatient treatment 3.5 hours away?
Uh, the idea of the responsibility of the adults who need to care for the children, the state assuming that authority. In the report, there was also kids are being taken away from their parents, are being taken by the state, and then out of convenience, perhaps, the state is putting kids into involuntary commitment because they didn't find other housing. Is that right?
I think it's a little more than they didn't find other housing, but that's a piece of it, certainly. I think our mental health system is fractured, is difficult to access. Kids in DSS custody are, by nature of their DSS involvement, eligible for Medicaid. So in this case, we're talking about Medicaid eligible people. And we hear that there's poor communication still, 13 years into our state's experiment in behavioral health managed care and Medicaid. We hear that there are still gaps in communication between DSS staff in a county. And this is in our state, it's a county system. So we're talking about, so Wake County is the capital, is where the capital is located. So the Wake County DSS has to work with the managed care organization that serves Wake County to get kids the services they need. If the DSS staff can't figure out how to make that happen because they're running into the same roadblocks that everyone else does, then the emergency department, from where they sit, the emergency department looks a lot safer than a foster home where there's been an incident of violence, perhaps, or sleeping on a couch in a social services office, which is also happening across our state.
So you've been tracking some of this data, and I think that's one of the things that we need more of is data and information about these processes and what's actually happening. You've been tracking it for a little while. What have you noticed about the rates of involuntary commitment? Are they going up? Are they going down? Are they the same?
Yeah, over the last decade and change, they've certainly gone up. And part of that is probably the changes in our mental health care system, that people have difficulty accessing the services they want when they're not in crisis. And so crisis is more likely to happen. And I think that's really, I mean, that's the bottom line. Like, we can talk about, the legal rights and the what is clinically best, and the constitutional protections and the Americans with Disabilities Act protections. But fundamentally, like, we just got to get people the help they need,
Mhm.
right? It shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't be that if you are a person who generally wants to be okay in the world, that you go through this ridiculous maze and then end up at an involuntary treatment facility instead of getting the help you need early on. That just is so deeply inefficient, um, not therapeutic, ineffective. It just is bad design, right? And of course, no one would design the system we have now from scratch to be what it is. It's artifacts of decisions over the years that kind of interact in ways that are less than optimal. But we just have to make community-based mental health services more available. And some of the things that we need are really in short supply. I mean, there's a nationwide mental health provider shortage, as I understand it. But also, we need to embrace newer and more effective models. Like, we've got a handful of peer-run respites in North Carolina. It's an incredibly effective and completely voluntary option for people who are experiencing distress and who do not want to run the risk of involuntary commitment associated with going to the emergency department. Typically, we're talking about a house in a neighborhood with 3 to 6 bedrooms, each with its own locking door and uh, privacy and comfortable surroundings, peers around you who have maybe had shared experiences. And the house itself is operated by a peer-led entity, which means people with lived experience who know where you are and have been there. You can walk out of your room and just have a conversation with someone who gets it. That's huge, right? How many of us have at one point or another been in our own home and been like, I can't talk about this here and now, right? That is a real challenge. A peer-led respite provides an opportunity for support that is non-coercive and non-clinical. Maybe you stay for 10 days, maybe it's less. And uh, people report very high satisfaction with that kind of support. So if that's what people want and need, and we also know it's really cost effective, why aren't we doing more of that? Right? On a less intensive basis, if you don't want to be in another place, you don't want to be sleeping in a different bed, you can engage with peer-led recovery resources in a peer living room or a resource hub, or there are other models where you can talk with folks with shared experience. You can learn about whether there are maybe clinical options that might suit you without submitting yourself to the scrutiny of that clinician, right, on the front end, which is really scary, especially if you've been involuntarily committed before. You can get guidance from other folks who have, gotten to a place in their lives where they feel like they can provide some support to others. It doesn't mean we're not all better, but we are living in the world, and there's no reason that people shouldn't be able to access that if that's what works. Why would we do that?
Yeah, one of the things that resonates with me is making sure people understand that this shouldn't be an easy option, that this is a serious option and people need to
Really,
consider it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying there should never, ever, ever be an involuntary commitment. I can conjure up a set of facts in which I guess it seems reasonable. Um, but it should be so rare, and it should be handled with such gravity and such care that everyone in the system is working to prevent it, if at all possible. And I think that we can get there. I don't think that that's unattainable. Um, I think, in fact, it is a smart investment of resources to build a system where people are in crisis less. That when they are in crisis, they know where they can go to get trusted help, and that they are not subjected in their time of crisis to coercion and detention and restraint.
Yeah, my first involuntary hospitalization, I was at a university. I knew something was wrong. I went to ask for help. Physician instantly diagnosed me with anorexia, and I found out later that she had had a patient diagnosed with anorexia who had died related to complications with that diagnosis. And so she was scared. The physician was
She had
scared.
her own trauma.
Right. And so she refers me to a psychologist. Like psychologist involves my parents. He asked me if I want my parents involved. I say yes. We all agree. Let's get him to a hospital. You're saying he's going to die? Let's get him to a hospital. I'm in agreement. I end up waiting in health services for 8 hours because they're saying they can't find a bed. And at the end of that 8 hours, the psychologist asked me to step out of the room. I step out of the room. They didn't feed me for 8 hours. I step out of the room, and there are two EMTs with a gurney, and they strap me down and they take me somewhere and they say they can't tell my family where I'm going. Uh, and so I'm wheeled into a psych ward, my first experience with it. They unstrap the gurney, the EMTs leave. Someone comes up to me and says, I need to take anything that's dangerous. And I thought it was a joke. I was like my shoelaces? And they said, yeah, your shoelaces, your belt. And so that was the moment where the sort of schism happened, where everything fell apart. I thought I was doing the right thing. I'm fortunate enough that I was able to bring a lawsuit against everyone involved. And the humbling part was I got to see them each testify in court what their reasoning was. And their reasoning was, this is how we do it. This is how we get someone a ride to the hospital. We know he needed to go there. We couldn't trust that someone else could drive him. And this is how you do it.
I'm so
And
sorry, Jesse. And
th-
and it, I wish it were unusual.
mhm. Well, and so from a very personal experience, there is the trauma that I live with in terms of I'm very scared of going into those situations, healthcare providers, anytime. But there's also, to this day, over 20 years later, me as a full-grown adult, real pain and conflict in my family. My parents who were told something by the psychologist that ended up being not true and not knowing how to handle that. And now our relationship is still has that pain and that conflict there. So when you're talking about people need to understand the possible ramifications, the possible consequences for the person who's already in distress. And so that's why I think this report and the work being done with it is so important that we do need speed bumps. We do need awareness. We do need to remind ourselves, adult, child, whatever the age, whatever the person, they are a human being and they have a life that you're taking them away from.
That's right. And I have goosebumps. I mean, I feel like you just named so many of the experiences that are in our report and are happening not just in North Carolina. We know that this is a broader problem. That's just the lens we use to look at it, and that's the space we're responsible for. But how have we allowed so many helping professions, right? Nobody becomes a doctor because they want to traumatize their patients. And yet we have these practices that are clearly traumatizing. And we've decided that trauma is preferable to whatever imagined consequence of not forcing intervention. And I think the fear of guilt looks scarier on the front end, but as you just named, the actual guilt and pain of engaging with a very broken system that defaults to forced treatment is, it has its own very real risks. And there are families all over the country who are grappling with that. There are people who don't go a day without thinking about whether they have harmed their own children, and children meaning offspring, adult children who really question whether their loved ones are safe places to go in times of need. And none of us are better off for that. None of us. The doctors are not better off. Those EMTs are not better off. They cannot feel like this is carrying out the purpose of their training, right? Your parents are not better off. You're not better off. Arguably, the location where you received treatment, based on our experiences talking to other folks, I would suggest there are probably some people on staff there who were traumatized by the experience.
And I think that's why this sort of work is so important. And as we wrap up, is there anything else about the report you want to highlight for people? And I encourage everyone to go check it out. We'll include a link in the show notes, but is there any other portion of the report that you want to highlight for people now?
Yeah, there's one piece that we haven't talked about that I want to bring to folks' attention, which is we hear from a number of emergency departments that long-term care providers, this could be what we call in North Carolina an adult care home or assisted living. That includes dementia care facilities, memory care facilities, skilled nursing facilities, group homes that serve adults with developmental disabilities or mental health disabilities, engage in what is casually referred to as patient dumping. When someone's behavior is difficult for the facility to manage, there are rules about discharge procedures, and discharge planning requires time and resources and energy to protect that patient's continuity of care, stability, and well-being. Completely reasonable. But if you take someone to the emergency department and petition them for IVC, and then say they can't come back, you can short circuit that whole process. And I don't think it is all done with ill intent. I don't, as we've talked about all of the players in this space, I think people do what they believe is best in the moment. But as a result, we have people, older adults usually, but often also adults with and children with serious disabilities who are in emergency departments, and no one knows them. No one knows their needs. If you're not a person who communicates verbally or communicates with your voice, and all the people who you spend time with every single day are gone from you, and you are in an emergency department, you might engage in some behaviors that are communication that are characterized as violent, harmful, dangerous, right? We've seen it. We've seen teenagers with autism who have been in a stable placement for a while, but their behaviors escalated. And now the entity that's been providing their care, whether that's family, clinical provider, whoever, takes them to the emergency department and says, I've tried to get help and I can't get it, and he can't be with me anymore. And We see that with older adults with dementia. Uh, if you are confused about where and when you are in the world, and then you are put in a big room with a lot of beeping machines and fluorescent lights and maybe restrained in 4-point soft restraints, um, that's traumatic. You may not be able to tell us exactly how it is traumatic, but that doesn't mean that the consequences aren't there. And so we also think that there are, um, we also think that long-term services and supports providers have a role to play in preventing IVC and potentially taking on some liability for when they choose that as the default setting.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes that sort of situation really complicated when a person is being pushed into something, maybe they're being abandoned, they're being tossed into a situation where they're desperate, where they're scared. And we are taught through culture, through clinical education, we are taught to identify diagnoses and attach preconceived notions to those diagnoses. So if
Right.
someone in an emergency department is desperate and scared and acts out, they say, well, it's the diagnosis. Anyone, anyone desperate and scared is going to act in some way.
I promise you my behavior would change if I were in a setting where I didn't have freedom of movement or any choice about, who is 10 feet away from me. And, emergency departments are stressful places in the best of times. It's not conducive to healing in a mental health crisis. Even if there was an actual mental health crisis
Right.
and actual dangerousness, oh, what a poor setting to try to address that.
Uh, Corye Dunn, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and thank you for talking about this report. I encourage everyone to go check it out. Link will be in the show notes. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jesse. I appreciate you coming to talk about it.